When the news broke, Hollywood didn't argue. It went silent. Within hours of the tragedy, messages began pouring in, not statements, not opinions, but grief. For decades, Rob Reiner had been a constant presence in American culture, shaping how generations laughed, loved, and understood one another. But in that moment, none of his films mattered. What shocked people wasn't just how he died, it was why his son's story ended the way it did. As details emerged, celebrities who had known Rob for a lifetime struggled to process what had happened inside that family. Their reactions were raw, unfiltered, heartbreaking, not about politics or blame, but about loss, confusion, and a question no one could answer. How does a life built on connection end in such devastating isolation? The answers, offered through tears, say more about Hollywood and ourselves than any headline ever could. He wasn't just a director, he was family. The first reactions didn't come from press releases. They came from voices cracking on air. For many in Hollywood, Rob Reiner wasn't a legend to be admired from a distance. He was present, personal, someone who answered calls, showed up unannounced, and stayed long after the work was done. That's why the shock landed so hard. Comedian and longtime friend Billy Crystal struggled to speak when the news broke. He didn't talk about movies. He talked about gratitude, about opportunities given quietly, without expectation, about a man who opened doors and then stood aside, letting others walk through first. Crystal described Rob not as a mentor, but as a protector, someone who made you feel safe enough to take risks, safe enough to fail. That distinction mattered. It reframed the loss as something deeper than fame. Hollywood wasn't mourning a career, it was mourning a presence that made the industry feel human. As the story unfolded, that sense of personal loss echoed again and again. The same phrase kept surfacing: he took care of people. And that made the ending almost impossible to accept. Because how does a life spent holding others together end in a family torn apart? The films everyone quoted, and the man they missed. As tributes spread, clips from Rob Reiner's work flooded screens. Not because they were asked for, but because people reached for them instinctively. When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, Stand By Me. These weren't just hits, they were emotional landmarks. Films people associated with first loves, childhood friendships, and moments when life felt simpler. Friends pointed out that Rob's stories always centered on connection, on people finding each other, choosing loyalty, and staying. That irony was not lost on anyone. Late-night hosts paused their shows. Actors shared memories of sets that felt unusually calm. Writers recalled notes that weren't about ego or control, but about honesty. Rob Reiner had built a career on empathy, and now, the conversation was about how empathy could exist alongside such devastating outcomes. Then came the reactions that cut the deepest. Friends admitted they had no language for this kind of ending. No script, no lesson. Several said the same thing in different ways. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. Not because of privilege or fame, but because of the kind of man he was believed to be. The more people talked about Rob's work, the clearer the contradiction became. His films taught audiences that understanding each other was possible, that love could bridge gaps, that families, even broken ones, could endure. And yet, none of that protected him at home. When grief turned into disbelief, as the focus shifted from Rob's career to the circumstances surrounding his son, disbelief hardened into something heavier. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a question with no comfortable answer. Friends who had watched Rob fight for others now wrestled with the limits of compassion. They spoke carefully. No accusations, no speculation, just a shared sense of disorientation. How do you reconcile a man who built his life on care with an ending defined by unimaginable harm? That question haunted every interview. Longtime collaborator Larry David offered one of the most restrained reactions and perhaps the most telling. He didn't analyze, he didn't editorialize, he simply said he couldn't understand it, and that maybe understanding wasn't possible. Coming from a man known for sharp commentary, the silence said everything. As reactions spread, something else became clear. Hollywood wasn't just grieving Rob Reiner, it was confronting its own vulnerability. Fame didn't insulate this family. Success didn't predict safety. Love didn't guarantee control. The shock deepened because it shattered an unspoken belief that some lives are protected by goodness alone. They aren't. By the end of the first wave of reactions, one truth settled in. This wasn't a story anyone wanted to tell, but one they felt compelled to face. Because if this could happen here, inside a family defined by warmth and generosity, then the line between stability and collapse was far thinner than anyone wanted to admit, and that realization would shape every reaction that followed. When mourning turned into controversy, just as Hollywood was beginning to grieve in private, the tone shifted abruptly. A public comment from Donald Trump reignited the story, not with sympathy, but with accusation. In a moment when friends and colleagues were still processing shock, the tragedy was pulled into a political frame. For many in the industry, the timing felt cruel. The reaction was immediate. Artists who had remained quiet suddenly spoke up, not to debate policy, but to defend a line they believed had been crossed. This was not about ideology, it was about boundaries. Several figures openly questioned whether there was any justification for politicizing a family's devastation while the grief was still raw. What angered people most wasn't disagreement. It was the absence of restraint, the sense that nothing, not even death, was off limits anymore. Hollywood, often criticized for speaking too much, responded here with something closer to collective disbelief. The tragedy had shifted from private mourning to public spectacle, and many felt that something deeply human was being lost in the noise. Have you no shame? The industry pushes back. As the controversy spread, the response grew sharper. Writers, comedians, and actors began pushing back with language rarely heard in moments of grief. One phrase echoed across platforms: "Have you no shame?" It wasn't aimed at winning an argument. It was aimed at restoring a sense of moral proportion. People spoke not just about Rob Reiner, but about his wife. About two lives reduced to talking points. About the idea that empathy itself was becoming optional. Several celebrities emphasized what they knew personally, that Rob was not the caricature being painted. He was generous. He was attentive. He was deeply involved in the lives of those around him. To them, the suggestion that he was somehow responsible for his own destruction felt not just inaccurate, but cruel. This was the moment when grief turned into defense. Not of politics, not of reputation, but of dignity. Hollywood has weathered scandals, accusations, and public reckonings before. But this felt different. There was no benefit to speaking out, only risk. And yet many did it anyway, because silence now felt like complicity. The pushback revealed something important. Beneath the cynicism often associated with celebrity culture, there remains a shared understanding of when to stop. For once, the industry wasn't divided along familiar lines. It was united around a single belief that tragedy should not be weaponized. A community forced to look inward. As the noise settled, the reactions became quieter but heavier. Friends of Rob Reiner began speaking less about outrage and more about exhaustion. Exhaustion with a culture that moves too fast to mourn. With conversations that demand conclusions before understanding. With a public that consumes pain and moves on. Several admitted that this tragedy forced them to confront uncomfortable truths, that even the most loving families can break, that access to resources doesn't equal protection, that compassion, while essential, has limits that are painful to acknowledge. What lingered most was a sense of vulnerability. If this could happen to Rob Reiner, a man defined by connection, generosity, and empathy, then no one was as insulated as they liked to believe. Fame offered no shield, success offered no immunity, and love, no matter how genuine, could not guarantee safety. Hollywood has always told itself stories about control, about managing outcomes, about shaping narratives. This story resisted all of that. There was no lesson that felt adequate, no ending that offered comfort. Only a recognition that some questions remain unanswered, not because people failed to ask them, but because there may be no satisfying answers at all. By the time these reactions reached the public, the story had changed again. It was no longer just about Rob Reiner or even his family. It was about the cost of losing empathy in moments that demand it most. And as the cameras moved on, that realization stayed behind, unresolved, heavy, and impossible to forget. In the end, this story leaves us with more questions than answers, and that may be its most honest legacy. Rob Reiner's life was built on connection. His work reminded people how fragile friendships are, how families shape us, and how empathy can bridge even the deepest divides. That is why this ending feels so unbearable. Not because it happened to a public figure, but because it happened to someone whose entire life argued that care and understanding still mattered. The reactions from Hollywood weren't about defending a name or settling scores. They were about protecting something far more fragile, the idea that grief deserves respect and that tragedy should never be reduced to ammunition. This moment asks all of us to slow down, to question how quickly we judge, to consider what happens when compassion is replaced by outrage and silence is mistaken for weakness. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect before reacting. Share your thoughts in the comments, not to argue, but to understand. Like this video if you believe empathy still has a place in public life, and subscribe for more stories that look beyond headlines to the human cost beneath them, because how we respond to tragedy says as much about us as the tragedy itself.